Chapter 6. An Invitation from the Coles. The Coles had lived in Highbury for several years. Because Mr. Cole was a merchant and had made money in trade, Miss Woodhouse did not invite the Coles to Hartfield. However, the Coles had now decided to give a dinner party, and they invited all the polite society of Highbury. Everyone received an invitation except Mr. Woodhouse and Emma. Emma had decided to refuse any invitation from the Coles, but she was angry when she was not invited. Then at last the invitation arrived. Inside it there was a handwritten note from Mrs. Cole. She explained why the Woodhouses' invitation had arrived late. They had been waiting for a screen to arrive from London. Mr. Cole had bought the screen so that Mr. Woodhouse would not feel any draughts in their house. It was a kind thought, and Emma changed her mind. She decided to accept the invitation from the Coles. But Mr. Woodhouse could not accept the invitation. He did not like staying out late in the evenings, and meeting large groups of people upset him. "Emma and I are not fond of big dinner parties," Mr. Woodhouse said to the Westons. "I shall stay at home, but you and Mr. Knightley can take care of Emma, so she should go." "I have asked Mrs. Goddard and Mrs. Bates to come to Hartfield on that evening, Papa," Emma told her father. "You can all have dinner together and then play cards. You will enjoy that." On the evening of the dinner party, the two old ladies arrived at Hartfield before Emma left. The three old friends all admired Emma's new dress very much. Emma's carriage arrived at the Coles' house at the same time as Mr. Knightley drove up in his own carriage. "I am very glad that you came in your carriage and that you did not walk here, Mr. Knightley," Emma said. "Everyone knows that you are a gentleman. Now you look like one. I shall be happy to go in with you." "Silly girl," Mr. Knightley said with a smile, as he and Emma went into the house together. Soon afterwards, the Westons arrived with Frank Churchill. The handsome young man looked round for Emma and hurried across the room to sit next to her. Frank Churchill and Emma Woodhouse sat next to each other at dinner too, and they had long and interesting conversations. It was a large dinner party, but Miss Bates, Miss Fairfax and Miss Smith had not been invited to dine. They were arriving after the meal, and would stay for the rest of the evening. Emma was very happy to be sitting next to Frank during dinner. Mr. Weston had told her that his son admired her very much. The young man was certainly paying Emma a lot of attention. During the meal, Emma heard the name of Jane Fairfax spoken. Mrs. Cole was talking about her, and Emma listened carefully. "I visited Mrs. and Miss Bates this morning," Mrs. Cole was saying. "Someone has sent Miss Fairfax a piano. It arrived in their house yesterday, and no one knows who sent it. It is a beautiful and expensive gift, but they think that it must have come from Colonel Campbell. Miss Fairfax is delighted, of course." "We have a piano here too," Mrs. Cole went on. "We hope that Miss Woodhouse will play it later this evening." "I should be very pleased to play your piano, Mrs. Cole," Emma replied. She saw that Frank Churchill was smiling. "Why are you smiling?" Emma asked, as she smiled too. "I am happy that Colonel Campbell has given Miss Fairfax such a fine gift," Frank replied. "If the Colonel did send the piano." "Perhaps Mrs. Dixon sent it," Emma said. "Or Mr. Dixon. You told me that Mr. Dixon admired Miss Fairfax. He admires her too much, perhaps. I think that is why Miss Fairfax did not go to Ireland. What do you think, Mr. Churchill?" "Well, I think that you may be right, Miss Woodhouse," Frank replied with a laugh. "Is it true that Mr. Dixon saved Miss Fairfax's life in Weymouth?" Emma asked. "Yes, he did," Frank said. "We were all in a small boat. The wind began to blow strongly and the sea became rough. Miss Fairfax almost fell into the water. Mr. Dixon caught her. It all happened very quickly, and everyone was very upset." Emma was silent for a moment. Then she said, "This is my opinion. I do not believe that the Campbells sent the piano. I think that it was Mr. Dixon's idea. He sent the piano to Miss Fairfax, and she knows it. Mr. Dixon is in love with Jane Fairfax. That is her secret. What else can it be?" Frank Churchill smiled at Emma, but he said nothing. After the meal, the ladies went into the sitting room. The gentlemen stayed in the dining room. They drank wine and talked about business, politics, and hunting. A little later, Harriet, Miss Bates, and Jane Fairfax arrived. They went and sat with the other ladies. Harriet looked very pretty, and Emma was glad. As usual, Jane Fairfax looked very elegant. She blushed when someone spoke to her about her new piano and Colonel Campbell. Half an hour later, the gentlemen came into the sitting room to sit with the ladies. Frank Churchill greeted Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax. Then he walked towards Emma and sat down beside her. Frank Churchill was paying Emma Woodhouse a lot of attention. He thought that she was the most interesting person in the room. Everyone saw this. "I have been in Highbury for nearly a week," Frank Churchill said to Emma. "I have been very happy here. Everyone is so pleasant, and I am never bored. When I was in Enscombe, I wanted to go overseas. Now, I would be happy to stay with my friends in Highbury forever." "And your friends would be happy too," Emma replied. Frank did not answer. He was looking across the room towards Jane Fairfax. "Is there something wrong?" Emma asked the young man. "What are you looking at?" "I am sorry, Miss Woodhouse," Frank said. "I was looking at Miss Fairfax's hair. What has she done to it? Those curls look very strange. She did not have curls in Weymouth. Is that hairstyle the latest fashion? I must go and ask her." Frank hurried across the room to speak to Jane, and Mrs. Weston sat down next to Emma. "I have something very interesting to tell you, Emma," Mrs. Weston said. "Miss Bates and Miss Fairfax came here in Mr. Knightley's carriage, and he will take them home again. What do you think about that?" "I think that Mr. Knightley is a very kind man," Emma said with a smile. "And I think that he is in love," Mrs. Weston said. "I think that he is in love with Jane Fairfax. I have made a match between Mr. Knightley and Jane Fairfax." "That is not possible," Emma cried. "I cannot believe that Mr. Knightley will ever want to marry, and he will certainly never marry anyone like Jane Fairfax. You are not good at matchmaking, Mrs. Weston. I am a better matchmaker, and Mr. Knightley will not want Jane Fairfax and Miss Bates at Donwell Abbey. Miss Bates would talk about her dear Mrs. Knightley all the time. No, I cannot believe that he will marry Jane Fairfax." "Then what about her piano?" Mrs. Weston said. "I believe that Mr. Knightley sent it. He knows that Jane loves music. I am sure that he is in love with her." At that moment, Mrs. Cole asked Emma to play their piano. Emma agreed and smiled, and she sat down at the instrument. As Emma began to play and sing, Frank Churchill walked over to the piano. He stood beside Emma and sang with her. They sang several songs together, and then Emma stood up. Miss Fairfax took her place. Jane played and sang much better than Emma, and soon Frank was singing with her. Mr. Knightley sat down beside Emma, but he was looking across the room at Jane Fairfax and Frank Churchill. "Miss Fairfax's voice is not strong," Mr. Knightley said angrily. "That young man is too fond of the sound of his own voice. He is making Jane sing too much. I shall ask Miss Bates to stop her." Mr. Knightley turned to Miss Bates, who was sitting near to them. "Miss Bates, are you mad?" he said. "Your niece is singing far too much. She will hurt her throat. Please stop her." Miss Bates was worried about Jane too. She hurried across to the piano and spoke to her niece quietly. Jane nodded and stood up. After this, Mrs. Weston started to play the piano, and the dancing began. Frank Churchill walked with Emma to the first dancing position, and other couples soon joined them. Emma looked at Mr. Knightley. Would he ask Jane Fairfax to dance with him? No, he did not. Emma was pleased. Mr. Knightley was certainly not in love with Miss Fairfax. There was only time for 2 dances, and then everyone prepared to go home. Frank took Emma to her carriage. "I am glad there was no time for more dances," Frank said. "I would not have enjoyed dancing with Miss Fairfax after dancing with you." Emma was pleased that she had gone to the Coles dinner party. The evening had made her think about a lot of things. Did Jane Fairfax have feelings for Frank Churchill? Emma did not think so. But she knew that Jane's playing and singing were far better than her own.